How the Russian Snow Maiden Helped Santa Claus. Father Frost is the Russian Santa Claus. Snegorochka is his granddaughter and his helper. This story is about them and the Santa of the North Pole. Santa Claus sat in his toy workshop at the North Pole, writing a letter to Father Frost, who is the Santa Claus for Russian children. Dear Father Frost, he wrote, I have a big favor to ask you. Mrs. Claus has to leave our North Pole to care for her sick sister. The reindeer and the elves have been doing their best to help me, but without Mrs. Claus, we cannot get all of the presents made and packages wrapped before Christmas. And just between us, reindeer cannot tie bows very well. Father Frost, since Russian children do not open their presents until New Year's, could you spare the Snow Maiden for a little while to come and help me out? Sincerely, Santa Claus. Father Frost was very happy to receive the letter at the Russian North Pole from his good friend Santa Claus. He smiled and said to himself, "Da," which is how Russians say yes. I will help Santa. I will miss Snegoroshka, that is the Snow Maiden's name in Russian, but it is my job to make children happy all over the world, not just in Russia. Besides, it would be good for Snegorochka to see something beyond the Russian North Pole. When Father Frost told Snegorochka that she was going by herself to help Santa Claus, she was both excited and frightened. She called Father Frost by his Russian name and said, Ded Moroz, I am only a little girl. How will I be able to take the place of Mrs. Claus? Father Frost answered, Snegorochka, you just do your best and be yourself. That will help Santa Claus most of all. Before she knew it, Snegorochka was packed for her trip. Father Frost reminded her to sit quietly next to him for a few minutes before leaving, because that is a Russian tradition. Santa Claus has sent his sled and the fastest reindeer to Russia to pick up Snegorochka to the North Pole. As Snegorochka was getting on the sleigh, Father Frost gave her a big hug. Then, just before the reindeer leapt into the sky, Father Frost reached into his pocket to give Snegorochka a gift. This little wooden doll will help keep company during your trip, he said, and it will remind you of your home in Russia. Santa Claus was very happy when Snegorochka arrived. Thank you for coming to help me and the elves and the reindeer, he said. Everyone is excited because we have never had a guest from Russia before. We would like to call you Snow Maiden, which is what your name is in English. The Snow Maiden was pleased to have a special English name. She and Santa agreed that they would call her Snow for short. When the Snow Maiden entered Santa's house, she immediately removed her boots. Traditionally, people do not wear their outside shoes or boots inside the house. They leave them at the door and wear slippers called tapuchki instead. Santa's workshop was even busier than the Russian North Pole, because Christmas comes before New Year's, which is when Russian children open their presents. The Snow Maiden did not know English very well when she first arrived, but she learned some polite words like thank you, which is spasiba in Russian. Everyone was working so hard to make the presents and wrap them that it was pretty easy for the Snow Maiden to understand what was going on. The Snow Maiden remembered what Father Frost had told her, and she tried to do her best all the time. However, no matter how hard she worked, something did not seem to be quite right. Santa Claus bustled around and seemed just like a right jolly old elf, as she had expected him to be from a famous poem. Yet he also seemed to be worried. The Snow Maiden was sad that she could not help Santa Claus even more. Every night before she went to sleep, the Snow Maiden tried to cheer herself up by playing with the wooden doll that Father Frost had given her. It was a special Russian doll called a Matryoshka doll. At first glance, the doll looked just like the Snow Maiden, with her long blonde hair and light blue gown. But all the Russian children know that Matryoshka dolls open up, and there are more toys inside. Inside the doll that looked like the Snow Maiden was a Father Frost doll. Inside Father Frost there was a snowman. Inside the snowman there was a Christmas tree, and finally, inside the Christmas tree there was a tiny wooden toy shaped like a Christmas present. Although the Matryoshka doll made the Snow Maiden feel a little better, she kept the doll as a secret. She was supposed to be taking the place of Mrs. Claus, and grown-ups do not play with dolls. One night the Snow Maiden got into bed, opened the doll, and the smallest piece, the little wooden Christmas present, fell out of her hands. The Snow Maiden looked for it everywhere, but it was lost. Then the Snow Maiden became even sadder. Russians worry a lot about bad luck, and the Snow Maiden wondered whether losing part of the doll meant that even worse things could happen. Maybe it meant that she would not really be able to help Santa Claus. The Snow Maiden cried herself to sleep. The next morning the Snow Maiden slept later than usual. In fact, when she woke up, Santa Claus was standing in the doorway, holding a glass of milk and some Christmas cookies. Mrs. Claus knows that children are not supposed to have cookies for breakfast, but she was not there. "Snow," said Santa Claus, "I think we should have a little talk. Last night I heard a little sound that I did not recognize at first. I only hear the sound once a year, when a child gives up hope that I am going to come to visit at Christmas. So it took me a little while to understand that you were crying. I know how hard you have been trying to help me, but I wonder if you might be homesick." The Snow Maiden could not stand it any longer, and she started to cry again. She was still sad that she had lost part of her doll, and now she was even sadder because Santa Claus thought that she was a homesick little girl. Santa Claus sat down on the bed to give the Snow Maiden a hug. "Ouch!" he shouted out. Santa and the Snow Maiden both leapt out of the bed, and there, on top of the red quilt, was the littlest piece of the doll that the Snow Maiden had lost the night before. "Oh!" said the Snow Maiden, and grabbed it quickly. But it was too late. Santa Claus definitely wanted to know what had hurt him so much when he sat down. So the Snow Maiden showed Santa the little wooden present. Santa, however, is an expert on presents and toys, and he could not understand why the Snow Maiden cared so much about one tiny wooden toy shaped like a Christmas present. By this time the Snow Maiden had given up trying to pretend that she was a grown-up. So first she showed Santa the Christmas tree that held the present, then the snowman, then Father Frost, and finally the Snow Maiden doll. When she was done, Santa had a thoughtful look on his face. The Snow Maiden was sure that he had decided that she was just a little girl and could not help him after all. She waited for him to call Dasher, Dancer, Donner, and Blitzen to take her back to the Russian North Pole. Instead, Santa Claus shouted, "Hooray!" Then he picked up the Snow Maiden up into the air and danced around the room. "Snow!" he cried, "you have solved all of my problems. I was worrying and worrying because I could not think of a new toy to make all of the children happy this year, and you had the perfect new toy with you all along." Then Santa Claus ran out of the room to the elf workshop to help the elves figure out how to make the Matryoshka dolls. Since Matryoshka looks like a hard word to say if you are not Russian, the first decision the elves made was to call them nesting dolls. The Snow Maiden stayed behind to drink her milk and eat her cookies, because she knew that she would have a long day helping Santa and the elves making the nesting dolls. As she smiled when she remembered what Father Frost had said to her, "Just do your best and be yourself." The end.